It was late December, about 2 years ago. Jason, my 10-year-old son, had just come to spend the weekend with me. We decided to grab dinner at this little diner I used to go to when I was younger. It was nothing fancy, just a cozy spot a little ways outside of town. The roads were quiet, blanketed in fresh snow. Jason sat in the passenger seat, humming along to a song on the radio. It felt like one of those perfect, peaceful moments, a rare bit of quality time together. The snow started picking up as we got closer to the diner. That's when I noticed something strange. The GPS said we were on track, but the road didn't look familiar. It twisted and turned in ways I didn't remember, the trees crowding in closer on either side. I figured the snow was just playing tricks on my memory. Jason didn't notice anything weird. He was busy making shapes on the fogged-up window. Then we saw the diner. Or at least, I thought it was the diner. The sign was barely lit, one of the bulbs flickering. The building looked older, like it hadn't been maintained in years. But it was the right spot. "Is this the place?" Dad Jason asked. "Yeah, buddy," I said, though I wasn't as sure as I sounded. We parked and got out. The snow was falling harder now, and the air was freezing. Jason skipped ahead toward the door, completely unfazed, while I followed, an uneasy feeling creeping into me. Inside, the place looked strange. It was empty. No staff, no customers, just the faint buzz of an overhead light. The tables were set, but everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, like it hadn't been touched in years. And there was a bad smell, like something decaying nearby. Jason didn't seem to notice. "Can I get pancakes, Dad?" he asked, smiling like nothing was going. Sure. I led him to a booth near the window and sat down, keeping my eyes on the room. Something wasn't right, but I didn't want to scare him. As Jason flipped through the menu, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure stood at the far end of the diner, just barely visible in the dim light. It was a man in an old, stained uniform, a server maybe, but his face wasn't visible. It was hidden in the darkness. "Good evening," he said. "What can I get for you tonight?" Jason didn't even look up. "Pancakes, please." I couldn't answer. My mouth was dry, and my heart was pounding. "Sir?" he prompted, tilting his head slightly. Pancakes," I stammered. The man nodded, turned, and walked toward the kitchen. Jason just kept doodling on his menu. "Do you think they have chocolate chips?" he asked. I forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm sure they do." Minutes passed. The man didn't come back. The silence in the diner was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the flickering light. I kept glancing toward the kitchen, expecting the man to reappear, and then I heard it. A faint whispering sound, coming from every corner. It was like voices speaking a language I didn't understand. Jason didn't react at all. He kept drawing, completely oblivious. "Jason," I said, "let's go. We'll eat somewhere else." He looked up at me, confused. "But I want pancakes." "We'll get pancakes later," I said, standing and grabbing his hand. As I turned, I froze. The man was standing at the far end of the diner again, but this time he wasn't alone. There were more of them, 3, maybe 4. They stood completely still, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. Jason tugged at my arm. "Dad, what's wrong?" I didn't answer. I just dragged him toward the door. The whispers grew louder as we stumbled outside into the snow. The parking lot was empty. Our car was gone. Jason didn't seem to notice. "Dad, it's cold," he kept saying, over and over. I turned back to the diner. The lights inside were off now, the building blending into the darkness like it had never been there at all. Somehow the car reappeared moments later like it had been there the whole time. I pretended like everything was normal. I got us inside, locked the doors, and drove away as fast as I could. Jason kept asking why we left, but I couldn't explain. I didn't want to scare him. To this day, he doesn't remember anything weird about that night, but I do. And every winter when the snow starts falling, I think about that diner. I know what I saw wasn't normal. I don't know what those things were or why Jason didn't feel what I felt. All I know is, I'll never take that road again. It was a freezing winter night, and I was about to go to bed in my rented house. I lived alone, and the place had always felt a little too quiet at night, but I'd gotten used to it. As I turned off the lights and lay down, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially not this late. At first I thought I might have imagined it, but then it rang again. The sound echoed through the house, breaking the silence. I sat up, annoyed. I figured it could have been a delivery mistake or maybe one of my neighbors needing something, so I got up to check. From the upstairs window, I pulled back the corner of the curtain to look down at the porch. I froze. There was a figure standing on the porch. The dim light barely outlined it, but it was tall, unusually tall. I couldn't make out much detail because of the shadows, but I could tell it wasn't someone I recognized. It didn't move, didn't shift its look around like a normal person. I hesitated for a moment, telling myself it was just someone passing through or maybe a lost stranger. I went downstairs, not in a hurry, but cautious now. As I reached the door, I leaned in to look through the peephole, expecting to see a face, maybe someone bundled up in a winter coat. Instead, I saw a dog. Strange, but not just any dog. Its face was right up against the peephole, as if it knew I was looking. The fur around its face was pitch black, and its eyes were dark and almost like they weren't there at all. Its breath fogged up the tiny glass. I froze in place, unsure of what to do. This didn't make any sense. Who lets a dog out in the dead of night, and how could it stand that tall? I backed away from the door, shaking my head. Maybe it was a stray, or maybe I was imagining things. Either way, I wasn't about to open the door to find out. I went back upstairs and got into bed, trying to shake it off. I told myself I'd check again in the morning, but for now, I just needed to sleep. That's when I felt cold. It wasn't the normal winter chill. This was different, biting and sharp. I turned toward the window was open. I never opened that window, especially in this weather. I sat up, staring at it, trying to process what I was seeing. Slowly, I got up to close it, but then I noticed something outside. There was a shadow. It wasn't just any shadow, it was tall, impossibly tall. Its legs thin and unnaturally long. Its head, it was the dog's face. But now it was distorted, stretched, with uneven teeth glinting faintly in the moonlight. It didn't move. It just stood there, staring directly at me. I couldn't look away. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen. My chest felt tight, and my legs felt weak. And then, I blinked. It was gone. I slammed the window shut, locking it with trembling hands, and stepped back, my heart pounding now. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every creak and gust of wind felt like it was coming back. Even now, I have no explanation for what I saw that night. I've tried to convince myself it was just my imagination or a trick of the shadows, but deep down, I know it wasn't. I don't look out my windows after dark anymore. It happened years ago, back when I was around 15 or 16. My family had moved into a small house in the middle of nowhere in Vermont. This wasn't your cozy cabin-in-the-woods type of place. It was more like a remote house where running to the store or meeting anyone meant a long drive. It was isolating, to say the least. We didn't stay there long, but something happened during that time. Something that still gives me nightmares to this day. It was January, just a few days after New Year's. My cousin Jason was staying over during our winter break, and like most teenagers, we spent the night in the living room, playing and watching movies. The house was eerily quiet, except for the howling wind outside. Vermont winters can be brutal, and that night, a snowstorm was raging. We were halfway through a movie, I don't remember which one, when I noticed Jason wasn't paying attention. His eyes kept darting toward the window. At first, I thought he was just zoning out, maybe watching the snowfall. But it got to the point where I couldn't ignore it anymore. Every few minutes, he'd glance toward the window, then back at the screen. Finally, I asked, "What are you looking at?" He didn't answer right away. He just kept staring out. Then he whispered, "I think I saw something." That was enough to set me on edge. We were surrounded by woods, miles from any neighbor, and the snowstorm outside made it almost impossible for anyone, or anything, to be wandering around. But Jason was dead serious. I got up and joined him by the window, trying to see what had caught his attention. For a few moments there was nothing, just the endless white of the storm. But then, just as I was about to dismiss it, I saw it too. A shadow. It moved quickly, darting between two trees about 200 feet from the house. There was no sound, just the faint outline of a figure. It was enough to make me scared. Jason and I looked at each other, trying to process what we had just seen. Before we could speak, it happened again. But this time, there were two shadows. They moved in opposite directions, one disappearing behind a tree, the other standing still. For a moment, it just lingered there, motionless, as if it were watching us. And then it ran, straight toward the house. Panic set in. I bolted upstairs to wake my dad. By the time he grabbed his gun and came downstairs, the shadows were gone. Jason was still at the window, his face frozen in fear. We told my dad what we saw, and to his credit, he didn't brush it off. Maybe it was the fear in our voices, or maybe he saw something himself. Either way, he checked every door and window to make sure they were locked, then stepped outside to investigate. When he came back, he didn't say much, just that everything looked fine. But the way he kept glancing toward the woods told me he wasn't convinced. The three of us spent the rest of the night in the living room. None of us slept. By morning, the storm had eased up, and daylight revealed what the dark had hidden. Footprints. There were tracks in the snow, several of them, leading up to the house and around the property. Some even circled beneath the very window where Jason and I had been sitting. What was even stranger, my dad swore those footprints hadn't been there when he checked the night before. We followed the tracks to our shed. The door was wide open, and inside, we found that some of my dad's hunting knives were missing. Nothing else. Just the knives. My dad decided not to call the police. It wasn't the first time he'd handled strange situations on his own. But after that night, we couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak, every gust of wind felt like something, or someone, lurking just out of sight. 2 weeks later, we moved. Not because of the incident, but because we had already planned to leave. Still, I was relieved to get out of there. It was the winter of 2014. I was just 13 years old, living with my family in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a city you'd expect to be picturesque, especially in the snow. But winters there weren't just snowy, they were brutal. The kind where the cold cuts through your layers and makes stepping outside feel impossible. One day, after a heavy snowstorm, school was canceled. I remember feeling thrilled. It was one of those rare snow days. I invited two of my friends, Josh and Shane, over to my place. They were about my age, though Shane was slightly older. We weren't going to let this day go to waste. We started off playing video games, but soon got bored and decided to play hide and seek in the basement. Now, my basement wasn't your typical dingy, unfinished space. It was massive, almost like a second living area. There was a pool table, a cozy lounge area, and even a mini theater. It was the perfect spot to hang out without disturbing my parents, who were napping upstairs. I was the seeker, so Josh and Shane ran off to hide. I gave them 20 seconds before yelling, "Ready or not, here I come." The game started off simple enough. I checked all the usual hiding spots, behind the couches, under the pool table, even in the storage closet. But I couldn't find them. Eventually, I made my way to the boiler room, a dark, creepy little space at the far end of the basement. The light in there had been broken for months, so I used my phone flashlight to see. As I entered, I noticed something strange, a tarp covering a tall figure in the corner. My first thought, gotcha, Shane. I walked closer, confident I'd found one of my friends. But when I yanked the tarp off, my heart stopped. Underneath wasn't Shane. It wasn't Josh. It was a man, filthy, disheveled, and holding one of my dad's power drills. He bolted the moment I uncovered him, running past me toward the basement door. I screaming, what had just happened? Then, I slammed the boiler room door shut, locking him inside. My friends came out of hiding, confused. When I told them what had just happened, We ran upstairs to wake my parents. My dad, half asleep and annoyed, didn't take me seriously at first. But when he saw how shaken I was, his demeanor changed. He grabbed a baseball bat and stormed into the basement. What followed was chaos. We could hear shouting and crashing sounds coming from the boiler room. My dad had caught the intruder trying to force the door open. The man swung the drill at him, but my dad, being a former military officer, managed to overpower him. By the time the police arrived, my dad had the man tied up, sitting on the floor. As the police questioned him, the man confessed that he had broken into our house through an unlocked door. He wasn't there to steal or harm anyone. At least, that's what he claimed. He said he was homeless and just needed a warm place to stay during the freezing winter night. Part of me felt bad for him, but I couldn't ignore the fact that he had a power drill in his hand. Whether his intentions were innocent or not, the thought of what could have happened still haunts me. After the incident, I couldn't sleep for days. The boiler room felt like it was tainted with this lingering presence of fear. It wasn't until years later, during a conversation with my dad, that I learned the full truth. He told me that when he opened the boiler room door that day, the man didn't just try to run. He lunged at him with the drill. My dad had fought him off, punching him multiple times before managing to restrain him. My dad never told me this when I was younger because he didn't want to scare me even more. But now, looking back, I realized just how close I was to real danger. The man was sent to jail and later transferred to a psychiatric hospital. I can only hope he got the help he needed. But every winter, when the snow starts falling and the nights get longer, I can't help but think of that day. It was a cold, moonless night. Kevin had just finished a short holiday with his family in a small town in Georgia. He was heading back to his college dorm in Atlanta because, guess what? Finals started the very next day. Kevin decided to take a shortcut to save time. This shortcut led through a dense forest. Locals had always warned about strange happenings in that forest. Rumors swirled about ghost sightings, eerie sounds, and disappearing travelers. But Kevin was a practical guy. He didn't believe in ghost stories. With headphones in, he ventured into the forested path, humming along to his playlist. As Kevin walked deeper, the silence grew deafening. Suddenly, headlights appeared behind him. It was a bus. Surprised, Kevin waved it down. After all, who wouldn't want to ride when the woods feel this creepy? The bus stopped with a loud creak. He stepped in, only to find every single passenger staring at him. Feeling uneasy, Kevin noticed an empty seat at the back and quickly sat down. But no matter where he looked, the passenger's eyes followed him, cold and unblinking. He shrugged it off, thinking, "They're just weird. Focus on your exam tomorrow." The bus conductor, an old man with sunken eyes, approached him. Kevin signaled for a ticket, but instead of handing it over, the conductor motioned for Kevin to come closer. The man's gaze was unnerving. When Kevin hesitated, the conductor's voice rasped. "Where are you headed?" Kevin muttered. "Atlanta. Will this bus take me there?" The conductor's lips curled into a strange smile. "This bus never reaches its destination." Kevin laughed nervously and turned to the man sitting next to him. "Weird conductor, huh?" he whispered. But to his shock, even his seatmate was staring blankly at him now. Panicked, Kevin tried to drown out the unease by blasting music in his headphones. Moments later, the bus jerked violently, throwing Kevin forward. He opened his eyes to a horrifying scene. The conductor's face twisted and burnt. The windshield was shattered, with shards scattered everywhere. Every passenger looked like a decaying corpse. Kevin's was completely scared. He bolted upright, desperate to get off the bus. But as soon as he stood, the passengers turned toward him, their movements slow but menacing. They rose from their seats, advancing like zombies. Before Kevin could react, the conductor appeared right in front of him, grabbing his throat with an iron grip. Kevin gasped for air as the conductor lifted him effortlessly and slammed him to the floor. Darkness enveloped him. When Kevin opened his eyes, he was in his bedroom. His mom sat by his side, her eyes filled with tears. Kevin, disoriented, asked, "What happened? Where's the bus?" His mom looked confused. She said, "He had been in a car accident deep in the forest. A kind stranger found you unconscious and called us. Kevin tried to explain, but his parents dismissed. Since that night, Kevin has never taken a shortcut through the forest again. But every so often, on moonless nights, he swears he sees headlights in the distance.